There was once a very different musician named John Lennon who wrote a song called Revolution. And people who didn't really listen to it thought it was a rah-rah call for revolution. No, it was the opposite. The lyrics are, you say you want a revolution? Well, you know, we all want to change the world. But if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't going to make it with anybody anyhow. There's a guy who understood how good intentions can turn into the insane arrogance of thinking your revolution is so fucking awesome and your generation is so mind-bendingly improved that you have bequeathed the world with a new kind of human. You're welcome.
Good morning. It is Monday, March the 20th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Star-Spangled Banner, we'll have no free lunch, restore the gold standard, Donald Trump, covert manipulation, rape of the mind, George-lakoff. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
The vices of modernism come from the master vice of pride, the vice so characteristic of an actual or wannabe aristocracy. It is prideful overreaching to think that social engineering can work, that a smart lad at a blackboard can outwit the wisdom of the world or the ages, that a piece of machinery like statistical significance can tell you how big or small a number is. Deirdre N. McCloskey. There is a huge reference to the knowledge problem here, and with that, the problem of top-down social organization. It is not merely the inefficiency or inadequate price discovery that renders such social engineering foolish. At its core, this very aspiration is prideful. It reflects a disdain for human experience and imputes to an elite few a mastery of the masses that no one deserves and that no one can dare handle.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. And again, the way to solve all these problems and get back to sanity, if you will, is a restoration of the gold standard. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, about 1 minute of Donald Trump.
Joe Biden recently announced that he will require every state, county, city, and town to submit so-called equity plans to impose the left's Marxist housing agenda on your communities. This is not what we need. The Biden power grab will put radical and racist left-wing bureaucrats in charge of micromanaging the housing where you live. And nobody can be happy about that. I talked about it during my last campaign, and people understood it very well. They will use the power of the federal government to abolish zoning for single-family homes, destroy your property values by building giant multi-family apartment complexes in the suburbs, and even next to your house, and force your community to pay for low-income housing developments right next door. The woke left is waging full-scale war on the suburbs, and their Marxist crusade is coming for your neighborhood, your tax dollars, your public safety, and your home. When I get back into the Oval Office, one of my first acts will be to repeal Joe Biden's radical left attack on the suburban lifestyle, just as I blew up Barack Obama's leftist housing monstrosity just a few years ago when I blew it up. The Biden war on the suburbs will be over, and it'll never happen again. That whole mess will never, ever happen again. We pray for our country. Thank you.
And that was Donald Trump about the Biden plan for the suburbs. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of Squawk Box, and they're talking about the banking system, and more specifically, they're talking about UBS purchasing Credit Suisse. So this is a tail end of this, and then I got a comment.
Billion in loans to First Republic. So it's a highly regulated industry, and I think you can have the rigors of the market around the equity investors and around the unsecured creditors. But I think we have to protect depositors to a different level than we have in the past. And I think that policy would be really, really good for our economy.
Yep, we've been asking that question. Is that too much moral hazard? But that's a different kind of moral hazard. And maybe you can do it with the FDIC. And it just seems like sooner or later, if it's too much, sooner or later the tax holders are going to be on the hook.
But I think on that insurance, it can be funded by the banking industry.
I know,
it's
really?
Not funded by the tax.
Every deposit? If there was a true crisis, I don't know.
What's the alternative, Joe?
I don't know what
I think that's a good alternative. The concentration is significantly greater today in U.S. banking than it was pre-2008.
Would you buy First Republic here at 18, Don?
We're not equity investors. I doubt it.
So anyways, what I'm trying to get to here is he says, what's the alternative? And what he's presenting you, and then he said something, I didn't quite get it. It sounded sort of like, I'm thinking because Joe was starting to interrupt him, something along the lines of, do we let him go out of business? And in a real economy, not a Keynesian economy, the answer would be yes. Of course we do. If they can't manage themselves, then they go bust, and that's it. Now, you say, well, gee, what about all the depositors? But anyways, let's get back to the point that he's providing a false dichotomy, that either we got to regulate the banks or we got to let them fail. Really, the answer to this is to restore the gold standard. We've experimented with Keynesian economics since the 70s. That's when President Nixon officially got us off the gold standard and put us onto Keynes. And the world's been on the Keynesian economic bandwagon, so to speak, for 30, 40 years, whatever, 50 years, something like that. And so it's time to restore. It doesn't work. The whole idea of Keynes was that it was supposed to create ever-increasing prosperity. No more boom and bust cycles. No more recessions. No more depressions. No more economies that go sky high, followed by a deep chasm, that kind of thing, right? Because that was supposedly the gold standard was responsible for that. So we get the government in charge of our money, and the government will smooth everything out, and we'll have steady growth. forever. I will do better than my parents, and my kids will do better than I will. Okay? That's according to Herbert Crowley, The Promise of American Life. Baloney. But anyways, it failed. We've had recession after recession after recession. We had 2008, which for all intents and purposes was a depression. They just don't call it a depression. And how many other situations of where we've had depressions that they just don't call it a depression because it's politically unpalatable. Then it's to admit that Keynesian economics has failed. And it has. Keynesian economics has failed. Regulating the banking industry has failed, and it was doomed to failure because it's based on the faulty idea that people that work for government are inherently more trustworthy and smarter and have everybody's best interests at heart, and the people that work for private concerns, the banks in this particular case, are just greedy people that will screw everybody in sight, and which is just wrong. The people that work for government are inherently more trustworthy than anyone else. And so, because in this situation, again, the question that's not being asked is, why wasn't it prevented? Where are the regulators? The regulators are supposed to be here to prevent this from happening. And they failed yet again. So what are we paying for? Why do we keep paying taxes and more taxes and more taxes for this? No. So, time to give up on Keynes and make a move to restore the gold standard. And that will solve the problem. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the next 3 covert emotional manipulation tactics.
16. The silent treatment. Supposedly, because of something you did, the manipulator refuses to communicate with you and uses emotional or physical withdrawal as punishment. This is commonly called the silent treatment, stonewalling or withholding. It conveys contempt and communicates that you are not worth the manipulator's acknowledgement of your existence, let alone his or her time, love, attention, or consideration. According to Steve Becker, LCSW, he writes, "The silencer's aim is, above all, to silence communication. More specifically, it is to render the other invisible, and in doing so, induce feelings of powerlessness and shame." Becker says the silent treatment is a technique of torture. This may sound hyperbolic, but human beings need, on the most basic level, recognition of their existence. The withholding of this recognition, especially if protracted, can have soul-warping consequences on personality. Giving the silent treatment is an effective way for a manipulator to get you to behave as he or she wants you to. 17. Lying. Lying is the granddaddy of manipulation tactics. Purposeful manipulators lie frequently and without remorse and have an arsenal of lying styles to work from. Others may feel remorse but will lie anyway to get what they want. Manipulators will say anything to get results. Many are expert liars who lie convincingly, frequently, and with impunity. Basically, a lie is a false statement deliberately presented as the truth. But there are many other ways to lie that go far beyond simply making a blatantly false statement. Those statements often work, though, because we can't believe that someone we trust would look us in the eye and tell us such a brazen, bald-faced lie. Lies of omission are one of the more subtle forms of lying. Instead of making a deceptive statement, the liar withholds the truth. For example, the manipulator may not tell you he's married if he thinks it would stop you from becoming involved with him. He didn't tell you he wasn't married. He just didn't tell you that he was. Vagueness is another subtle form of lying. When you confront a manipulator about something, they respond, but their answer is lacking in details. They count on you not to probe them for more information. An especially effective way to lie is to hide it in the middle of a litany of truths. Liars lie to avoid taking responsibility, or to get you to believe what they want you to believe in order to get something they want. 18. Invalidation. Invalidation is rejecting, diminishing, ignoring, judging, or making fun of someone's feelings. Invalidation is a highly detrimental form of emotional manipulation. Unfortunately, it happens all too often, and there even seems to be an epidemic of it in society. People invalidate others for a variety of reasons, sometimes purposefully and sometimes not. An abuser will use invalidation as a tool of manipulation and as a weapon. Others who invalidate may be short on empathy. Some may feel uncomfortable with your pain or feel powerless to do anything to help you. Others are simply jealous. Examples of invalidating statements made in response to you expressing your feelings or talking about a difficult situation. You should be ashamed of yourself for feeling that way. It could be worse. You shouldn't feel that way. Just don't worry about it. Get over it. Stop taking everything so personally. Lighten up. You must be kidding. It can't be that bad. You're just tired. It's not worth getting upset over. Just drop it. I'm sure she didn't mean that. Time heals all wounds. Every cloud has a silver lining. You can choose to be happy. It's frustrating not feeling understood and not getting the emotional support you reached out for. Invalidation makes you wonder if there is something wrong with you for feeling the way you do. It undermines self-confidence because it causes self-doubt. This, in turn, diminishes self-esteem. Invalidation will be explored in more depth in a later chapter.
And that was the next three of the covert emotional manipulation tactics. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the rape of the mind, needling for the truth.
Needling for the truth. During the Second World War, the technique of the so-called truth serum, the popular name for narcoanalysis, was developed to help soldiers who had broken down under the strain of battle. Through narcoanalytics by means of injections and sedatives, they could be brought to remember and reveal the hyper-emotional and traumatic moments of their war experiences that had driven them into acute anxiety neurosis. Gradually, a useful mental first aid technique was developed which helped the unconscious to reveal its secrets while the patient was under the influence of the narcotic. How does the truth serum work? The practice is simple. After an injection, the mind in a kind of half-sleep is unable to control its secrets, and it may let them slip from the hidden reservoirs of frustration and repression into the half-conscious mind. In certain acute anxiety cases, such enforced provocation may alleviate the anxieties and pressures that have led to breakdown. But narcoanalysis often does not work. Sometimes the patient's mind resists this chemical intrusion, and enforced intervention in such a situation often obstructs the way for deeper and more useful psychotherapy. The fear of unexpected mental intrusion and coercion may be pathological in character. When I first published my concept of menticide and brainwashing, I received dozens of letters and phone calls from people who were convinced that some outside person was trying to influence them and direct their thoughts. This form of mental intrusion delusion may be the early stage of a serious psychosis in which the victim has already regressed to primitive magic feelings. In this state, the whole outside world is seen and felt as participating in what is going on in the victim's mind. There is, as it were, no real awareness of the frontiers between I, the person, and the world. Such fear-ridden persons are in constant agony because they feel themselves the victims of many mysterious influences which they cannot check or cope with. They feel continually endangered. Psychologically, their fear of intrusion from the outside can be partially explained as a fear of the intrusion of their own fantasies from the inside, from the unconscious. They are frightened of their own hidden, unconscious thoughts, which they can no longer check. It would be a vast oversimplification to stick an easy psychiatric label on all such feelings of mental persecution, for there are many real, outside mental pressures in our world, and there are many perfectly normal people who are continually aware of and disturbed by the barrage of stimuli directed at their minds through propaganda, advertising, radio, television, the movies, the newspapers, all the gibbering maniacs whose voices never stop. These people suffer because a cold, mechanical shouting world is knocking continually at the doors of their minds and disturbing their feelings of privacy and personal integrity. There is the further question of whether or not drugs used in the truth serum always produce the desired effect of compelling the patient to tell the inner truth. Experiments conducted at Yale University in 1951, J.M. McDonald, on 9 persons who received intravenous injections of sodium amytal, the so-called truth serum, showed interesting results, tending to weaken our faith in this drug. Each of the patients, prior to the injection, had been suggested a false story related to a historical period about which he was going to be questioned. The experimenters knew both the true and the false story. Let me quote from the report. It is of interest that the 3 subjects diagnosed as normal maintain their suggested stories. Of the 6 subjects diagnosed as neurotic, 2 promptly revealed the true story, 2 made partial admissions consisting of a complex pattern of fantasy and truth, 1 communicated what most likely was a fantasy as truth, and the 1 obsessive-compulsive individual maintained his cover story except for 1 parapaxia, faulty or blundering action. In several cases, American law courts have refused to admit as evidence the results of truth serum tests, largely on the basis of psychiatric conviction that the truth serum treatment is misnamed, that, in fact, narcoanalysis is no guarantee of getting at the truth. It may even be used as a coercive threat in cases where victims are not aware of its limited action. Still, another danger, more closely related to our subject, is that a criminal investigator can induce and communicate his own thoughts and feelings to his victim. Thus, the truth serum may cause the patient with a weak ego to yield to the interventionist's synthetically injected thoughts and interpretations in exactly the same way the victim of hypnosis may take over the suggestions implanted by the hypnotist. Additionally, this method of inquisition by drugs contains some physical danger. I myself have seen cases of thrombosis develop as a result of intravenous medication of barbiturates. Experiments with mescaline, which started 30 years ago, are suddenly fashionable again. Aldous Huxley, in his recent book, The Doors of Perception, described the artificial chemical paradise which he experienced after taking the drug known as peyote. It can stimulate all kinds of pleasant subjective symptoms, but these are, nevertheless, delusive in character. I do not want to start a clinical argument with an author I esteem, yet his own euphoric, ecstatic reactions to mescaline are not necessarily the same as those other people experience. 25 years ago, I myself experimented with mescaline in order to make a first-hand acquaintance with genuine pathological thoughts. I nearly collapsed as a result. Only a few people have had the ecstatic experiences Huxley describes. Mescaline is dangerous stuff when not used under medical control. And anyway, why does Mr. Huxley want to sell artificial heavens? There is a very serious social danger in all these methods of chemical intrusion into the mind. True, they can be used as a careful aid to psychotherapy, but they can also be frightening instruments of control in the hands of men with an overwhelming drive to power. In addition, they fortify more than ever in our aspirin age the fiction that we have to use the miracle drugs in order to become free-acting agents. The propaganda for chemical elation, for artificial ecstasy, and pseudo-nirvanic experience contains an invitation to men to become chemical dependents. And chemical dependents are weak people who can be made use of by any tyrannical political potentate. The actual propaganda carried on among general practitioners urging treatment of all kinds of anxieties and mental disturbances with new drugs has the same kind of dangerous implications.
And that was Needling for the Truth from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-Meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now about 8 minutes of the rest of Chapter 6 of Don't Think of an Elephant by Dr. George-Lakoff.
Progressive and conservative worldviews contradict each other. Both are characterized in the brain via neural circuitry. How can you have contradictory neural circuits in the same brain? Easy. The answer is mutual inhibition, a very common kind of brain circuitry. When one circuit is active, it turns off the other. Which is turned on at a given time is a matter of context. Someone with both worldviews applies them to different issues in different contexts, resulting in the brain circuits for the different values unconsciously and automatically switching back and forth depending on the issue. That's what it means to be a biconceptual. It is often these biconceptuals who, as voters, are the target of intense campaign attention. But Republicans understand how to appeal to them better than Democrats do. Recall that all politics is moral and that a voter's implicit sense of morality is absolutely central to a voter's identity. Since biconceptual voters have both moral systems, mostly one but partly the other, conservatives need to keep their voters and attract the partly conservative moderate Democrats. Conversely, progressives need to keep their voters and attract partly progressive moderate Republicans. There is an honest strategy for achieving this goal, and also an Orwellian one. The honest strategy is to use only your language and avoid using the other side's language. That will maximally activate your moral system in the moderates on the other side. The Orwellian strategy involves using the other side's language in an attempt to reach those with moderate or opposing views. But if you use Orwellian language, you will be activating the other side's moral system, making it stronger and shooting yourself in the foot. However, some political organizations use Orwellian language. For instance, an hour before writing this, I received a robocall from the Center for Worker Freedom asking me to support a measure that they said would support worker freedom. They are an anti-union organization, and the measure is anti-union, though the telephone message didn't mention that. They were trying to fool Democrats into supporting an anti-union measure out of ignorance. It is vital that progressives understand why just citing the facts doesn't work, and why attention to public discourse must be constant, not just focused on elections. Here are the basics that progressives need to understand. There is a crucial logic to the way the brain works with respect to public discourse. Here are 10 key points to that logic. 1. The more a brain circuit is activated, the stronger its synapses get. 2. The stronger its synapses get, the more likely it is to fire and the stronger the firing is. 3. When two circuits inhibit each other, the stronger one circuit gets, the weaker the other gets. 4. Suppose two mutually inhibitory circuits apply to different issues. As one gets stronger and the other gets weaker, the more likely it is the stronger one will start applying to more issues and the weaker one to fewer issues. 5. Language changes the strength of those circuits. Conservative language activates circuitry for the conservative worldview. Progressive language activates circuitry for the progressive worldview. 6. Imagery fitting one worldview or the other matters as much or more. 7. Frequency of language use and imagery matters. The more frequent the language use or imagery, the more strengthening occurs. 8. Journalists are trained to use the most frequent language in public discourse. 9. The conservative turn in America has come from the constant use of conservative language in public discourse. So much so that progressives have often adopted conservative language, thus helping the conservative cause. 10. Because of the effect of language and imagery on the brain,
The constant use of one ideology's language over the others has an enormous effect on our politics. Conservatives have been doing a better job at getting their language into public discourse. The enormous conservative communication system has done its job well, especially on the central issue of our democracy, that the private depends on the public. The central conservative strategy to minimize or even eliminate public resources has been to eliminate the money that funds public resources. Taxes. Taxes for the wealthy have been cut by conservatives, who have defended huge tax loopholes, and have even drastically cut funding for the IRS so that there are not enough IRS workers or modern computers for the IRS to monitor tax evasion, mostly by the wealthy. Since the 1970s, the concept of taxation has shifted from the source of needed and often revered public resources to the idea that taxation is a burden, an affliction in need of tax relief. The constant talk of taxation as an affliction and a burden has led biconceptuals to switch to viewing taxation as a burden rather than something that makes our private lives possible, or that creates a base from which corporations prosper. While conservatives drive these frames home, progressives don't realize that they have to drive their own frames home, and only later realize that the conversation has completely changed. Suddenly, not just conservatives are talking about the burden of taxes instead of the value of public services, but so are the media. So are moderates, and eventually the tax relief language works its way into even progressive discourse. The term Tea Party was chosen to make it sound patriotic to oppose taxation. The only progressive who has succeeded in getting across the idea that the private depends on the public is Elizabeth Warren, who has argued it repeatedly, and did so with special success when she was running for the Senate in 2012. At one point in his presidential campaign, President Obama tried the argument, but messed it up when he tried ad-libbing in a public talk and said, "If you've got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen." Conservatives jumped on his remark and attacked him viciously for it. He could have fixed it by making the point correctly the very next day and every day thereafter, getting the idea out into public discourse and allowing the press to do its job and present the overwhelming evidence for it. But the president was too timid and dropped it, missing a major opportunity to change public discourse. Can progressives turn this around? Yes, but not without serious conscious commitment. The president and every progressive candidate, office holder, and public figure of any kind can start now. Say it right, over and over. Connect the private depends on the public concept to something that conservatives will understand. Freedom. Public resources allow for freedom in case after case, opening up all kinds of opportunities in life. It is the freedom that public resources afford that makes them central to democracy. Saying it right and saying it over and over is advice that can be applied to issue after issue.
And that's Don't Think of an Elephant by Dr. George-Lakoff. And a couple of things that I wanted to mention here is how his whole approach on this book, first of all, brain circuitry. He doesn't talk about the mind, or he says he doesn't use the word the mind or the psyche, but he says that it's all about brain circuitry, and he goes on to explain that the way the brain circuits work. Now, of course, all of this is he's asking us to take his word for it, but it's also deterministic. What he is suggesting here is that we're all victims of our brain circuitry, and that if the people that think conservative are just victims of bad brain circuitry, and that you have to rewire them to the correct brain circuitry so that they could become good progressives. Okay, but the fact of the matter is we're not victims of anything. We think. We use our minds, we think. We have discussions, we have debates, we consider the facts and other things, and we make decisions. We're not victims of anything. The other thing is, he says, tax cuts for the rich. And he goes on about taxes and how Republicans have supported this, that, and the other thing. If you ever get somebody that's doing this to you, again, what are they doing? They're making an arbitrary claim. And one of the best ways to handle that arbitrary claim is simply to deny it. So he says, well, Republicans have given tax cuts to the rich. You say, no, they haven't. And they say, that they've created all these loopholes in the tax laws for the rich. No, they haven't. That they have gone ahead and prevented the IRS from getting new equipment so that it can be more efficient. No, they haven't. That's all you have to do. Because the burden of proof is on, in this case, Dr. Lakoff. It's on him. He has to produce the evidence and the proof that some such things actually exist, actually happened. Okay? So that's the way to handle that one. Another one is that he's talking about his public discourse. That President Obama missed an opportunity to change public discourse. Again, another deterministic suggestion here, suggesting that we're all victims of public discourse, and we're not. There are conversations, there are debates, there are arguments, but there is no such thing as public discourse. Back in a minute.
Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look, and you'll see into your imagination. We'll begin with a spin, traveling in a world of my creation. What we'll see will defy explanation. If you want to feel paradise, simply look around and view it. Anything you want to do it. Want to change the world, there's nothing to it. If you truly wish to be, if you truly wish to There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination.
This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So I'm reminding you that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.